Hi, my name's Chris Dixon. This is Founder Stories. Today we have the mayor of New York City.
Hi, guys.
And the founder of Bloomberg. Thank you very much for being here.
Happy to be here. Thanks for having me.
Can you talk a little bit about the beginnings of Bloomberg LP?
Well, it came about because I got fired. I was working on Wall Street for a firm, Salomon Brothers and Hutzler, which became Salomon Brothers, which became Fibro, which became Smith Barney, which is now part of Citibank or something like that. But after 15 years there, I sort of had different views about what the company should be doing, and it was time to go, and left on great terms. We had sold the company at the same time, so they didn't have the concept of severance. Everybody says you got big severance. I didn't, but I did own a piece of the firm, and so that was over the number of years I sold that. And I used that money to go start a company. Why? I think in my case, it wasn't I had this grand vision. Nobody offered me a job. I was probably too proud to go look for one. I said, well, why not start your own company? And it turned out great. I mean, I'm happy. You should get fired the same way.
And how did you have the idea for it?
I had at Salomon Brothers, my first job was working, first job was counting securities because that's what you did every night, went out to the banks and came back. And then I got to the back office where you stamp tickets, and then eventually got to one of the trading desks. And one of my jobs as the junior person on the desk was to go through 10 editions of the Wall Street Journal and write down the last sale on any stock we wanted to trade. So we'd have a list, and then I went to Standard & Poor's, sold data in paper form, which I had to put in every night in alphabetical order. And then I'd get the page so we could see what the company did, and et cetera, et cetera. And I'd read about computers. And I said to the company, we could do this. And they said, well, if you want to work on it at night, fine, you're not getting any extra money or anything. You can't not do your day job, but if you want to do it. And so over a couple of years, with some help from a few other people at Salomon, a guy named Jesse Gristel and John Loughborough, if I remember the names, haven't seen him in years, we went and built a computer system so that some of that data was retrievable at the touch of a button. And then later on, it built it again and made it more expansive, went into the bond business as well as the stock business. But when I got fired, I thought, there was a market for this outside of that company. And I had tried to convince them that we should sell it outside. They didn't want to do it. So I had 3 other people from the company join me. The first day, we all went home and cleaned out our files and made sure not one of us had one piece of paper left over from the old days, so nobody could ever come back and say we took anything. And then we started the company.
I read your book. You also wrote everything in a different language. Didn't you do
Yeah,
that?
we
You
did a number of
clean room
different things so that nobody could say that we, but there was never an issue about that. And Salomon, the people that left there, even the people that fired me, all became customers and still all friends. But I went out and looked at the market and said there's a demand for exactly what we needed at Salomon Brothers, the ability to retrieve data quickly when you had to make decisions. And most of it was not in machine-readable form, so we'd have to have a system to type it in. Then the data quality wasn't very good, so we had to have a system to verify the data, scrub it, if you will. We also didn't have any ways of distributing it, because when I started the company, you won't believe this, but the internet didn't exist and PCs didn't exist. And so I spent every Saturday at an engineer's barn up in Connecticut, soldering resistors and capacitors into the circuit boards. We built 20-odd terminals. That's all we had money for. And then when we put them on, we got slightly bigger, we had to have some out of town. The internet didn't exist, so we would rent a line from here to Chicago. I'd go out to Chicago because I was not a software guy. I was the chief cook and bottle washer and the salesman for the company. And I'd go out and I'd find somebody who would rent us a closet. And so the phone line would terminate in the closet, and we'd buy an off-the-shelf mux so you could have 3 or 4 users connected to that line with local lines. And if it broke, I had to wait until I had time and could get a reservation on a plane and fly out and fix it. And eventually, when PCs came along, we went out of the hardware business overnight. I said, we just can't compete and don't want to be in that business. PC, we're not going to have a better PC, and that's not what we sell. We sell the ability to access the information and good information presented in a useful way, but the hardware really didn't have anything to do with it. And when the internet came along, we swapped over right away to use the internet. And it's interesting, we complain about problems, but it's infinitely better than what it was before. People don't remember.
And it's now massively successful, obviously. But was it successful at the beginning, or was it hard
You
at
know,
the beginning?
people ask that. It's 3 years from start to when we had our first customers. Our first customer was Merrill Lynch. They bought 20 terminals, and we sold them for, I think, $895
Was that
a month.
R&D, or was it, or also just selling?
I sold every day. I would go downtown, and I would buy cups of coffee, black and with milk and without, and then tea with milk and without, and some sugar on the side. And I'd take these cups in a bag, and I'd go up to Merrill Lynch, and I'd walk down the floors. A friend had given me a pass so I could get in. And when I'd see somebody sitting in an office trying to read the newspaper at 7 in the morning, I'd go in and say, "Hi, I'm Mike Bloomberg. I bought you a cup of coffee. Can I talk to you?" Well, no matter how annoyed the person is, if somebody bought you a cup of coffee, you just don't say no. And so I developed relationships, and I found out who would be the people I really had to sell to and what they could use, and over time. And then they became my first customer, and I remember doing the multiplication of the 20 terminals times 12 months times the revenue per month, the charge per month, and comparing that total number to whether or not we could pay the bills. And we were close to break even. But the first year, you go into it, everything's, you don't think about the downside. The second year is the difficult one. The third year, you see that that light at the end of the tunnel is not a train coming towards you. It really is the end of the tunnel. The middle year, when every 2 weeks I had to go to my checking account, take money, all the money that I'd made at Salomon Brothers, and put more money into the company's checking account so I could pay the salaries.
Is this going to work?
And people, they mean to be nice. Mike, I know what you're doing. You're right, I'm sure. But just in case, or are you sure? Entrepreneurs can't answer the questions that, for example, government needs before you put government money. What's it going to look like? How are you going to build it? What color is it going to be? Who's going to sell it? How much you're going to charge for it? What's it going to be called? None of those things do you have an answer for at the beginning. And so maybe appropriately with government money, you can't put it into a project that's so ill-defined, which is why governments don't innovate. But, excuse me, but it's also true why big companies don't innovate, because they develop a bureaucracy that makes a lot of sense, but it prohibits or prevents real innovation. And I saw recently there was an article, somebody criticizing corporate boards, that they should lose their compensation and be liable if the company made a mistake, and that they should prevent anybody in the company from taking risks. And all I could think about, it was just a few days after Steve Jobs died. Steve Jobs would have been thrown out a second time.
Yeah.
And it's you got to have some balance. Yes, you need some checks and balance, but you also have to have some things that you can go and do with your gut. And that's where the great things are done.
Yeah. And at the time, what was the New York tech? There was sort of no New York tech scene, I guess.
There was no New York tech scene, is fair. The financial markets were here more than any place else. And I think what's happened over the years, particularly in the last half a dozen years, is New York has become a center. It was for media, but now it's become for IT as well. It was for the theater, but now it's become for radio, television, advertising as well. It was for hospitals. Now it's becoming a biotech center. For fashion, we had some stores, but today we have more fashion houses than Paris does. And you go right down the list, and what we're trying to do, and it all comes from one of my guy who's now running, one of the two guys running my company, Dan Doctoroff. He was our deputy mayor for economic development, and he talked about a 5-borough economic diversification plan, which the press didn't want to hear about. In every speech, it was in there. It became a joke. But in fact, the reason we just got through this recession much better than any other city in this country, almost any other city, is because we have diversified our economy. But IT is one of them, and you can see Google buys a block square building to put a lot of people in. Bloomberg has 7,500 people here, a lot of whom are tech people. Reuters, the same thing. Companies, whether it's Facebook or Twitter or Microsoft, every one of these companies is starting to open in New York. And I think the reason is, and I've said this before, if my company hadn't been started in New York, it never would have done as well. But we are a company that needs intellectual capital. If you're growing corn, you need big open space. If you want to have a steel mill, you may need access to coal. But what drives a company like ours is intellectual capital. And so I have to have a company where the people that we need to be successful need to have join us, where they want to live. And so the business strategy, if you will, of New York City government is not to subsidize companies, not to pay for people to bring jobs here. It is to invest in parks and cultural institutions and better public schools and lower crime to get the best and the brightest to want to live here. And then if you start a business, you don't have much choice. Or you can, but if you want to really be successful, you've got to go with the best and the brightest. It's also true in this day and age, people change jobs much more frequently than when I was started out in the business world. And so they want to be where other companies are. So it's one of these things, once you get momentum going, then it keeps going. How you lose that, I don't know. Everybody does eventually, but hopefully not for a long time.
One thing I think some of us old timers like me worry about is in the 90s, New York had sort of Silicon Alley, and then the downturn happened, and I think it retrenched a lot. And I think how do we sustain it this time?
I was with a company who went from 300 employees to 4 to 300, but he kept the company going. The owner, a guy that founded it, convinced his creditors to not foreclose. He convinced his landlord, I guess, to let him keep some space or whatever, and he toughed it out. The world is cyclical. It goes through ups and downs, and you have to prepare. And, a young growing company says, well, how much space should I take? Because if I don't ever want to be out of space, but if I take too much, I won't be able to afford it. I always took too little space. And one of the great stories we were in a building on Park Avenue, the 9th floor. We started out with 2/3 of it. Eventually, we got the whole floor. And in one corner and sort of around the corner of the building was our sales office. It was like a double or triple wide office. We'd taken out the walls in the middle, and we didn't have enough room. So I went in on a Saturday morning with a couple people and brought a saw, and we literally cut the ends off the returns on the desks, shortened them by a foot or two, and then screwed them back in and put in a few more desks. And it was fascinating. On Monday, people came in and said, they moved the desks around. And it took a while before somebody realized, my God, there's more desks here than before. And then a little while longer before they realized the desks were shorter. Awesome. But you can always take my advice to an entrepreneur is don't overexpand. It's a nice problem to have of not having enough space. It's a very bad problem to have too much.